Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we dive into a history that's been chilled, carbonated, and carefully scrubbed over the last century and a half. Close your eyes and imagine you're strolling down a dusty, gaslit street in post-Civil War Atlanta, Georgia. The air is thick with the sweet, cloying smell of bruised peaches and coal smoke. You hear the clop of horse hoofers and the low, constant murmur of a city trying desperately to forget the devastation it just suffered. You trudge past the Marietta Street Pharmacy, and if you were to peer through the window right now, you'd see a man bent over a mortar and pestle, a man whose quest for relief would inadvertently launch the world's most recognizable brand. This isn't a story about bubbly refreshment. It's a story about desperate medicine and liquid euphoria. And the surprising truth is that the history of your favorite soft drink is inextricably linked to the history of illicit drugs. You're about to discover the pharmaceutical origins of the world's most ubiquitous beverage. And frankly, knowing what you're about to hear, you probably won't survive this tonight's revelation without at least one uneasy sip of something cold tomorrow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The man in question is Dr. John Stiff Pemberton, and he's not just any pharmacist. He's a tragic figure of the Old South, a man defined by a single, catastrophic wound. As a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army, Pemberton led a cavalry unit, and near the end of the war, he suffered a horrific saber injury to his chest. The pain was unrelenting, a constant sharp companion that settled deep into his bones. You see him wincing now, even as he measures out precise pinches of white powder. To manage the agony of his injury, Pemberton, like countless veterans on both sides, became dependent on the era's primary, readily available painkiller, morphine. Back then, you could stroll into nearly any pharmacy, even one he owned, and walk out with a bottle of the potent opiate. The trouble, of course, was that while it stopped the pain, it ensnared the man. Soon, he realized he'd traded one suffering for another, the crippling addiction. Pemberton, a professional chemist with an entrepreneurial spirit, didn't want to be a morphine addict. He wanted to be an innovator. The prevailing medical philosophy of the time wasn't just about curing illness. It was about addressing nervous exhaustion, a catch-all diagnosis for everything from anxiety to chronic fatigue, which was believed to be a consequence of the fast pace of modern post-war life. The marketplace was flooded with patent medicines promising to restore vitality, and Pemberton was determined to invent a better tonic, one that would offer the pain relief and mood lift of morphine without its devastating side effects. Why, night owls? His attention turned to a plant that was causing a buzz in pharmaceutical circles, the coca leaf, Erythoxylum coca. Now, you might associate the coca leaf only with its infamous derivative, but in the 1860s, it was considered a legitimate botanical wonder. It had been used for thousands of years by indigenous peoples in the Andes for endurance, to suppress hunger, and to combat the effects of high altitude. Europeans, ever eager to exploit and rebrand global resources, were captivated by its stimulating properties. This wasn't a fringe idea. Pemberton was following a mainstream historical fact. The use of coca-based elixirs was exploding across Europe, spearheaded by Angelo Mariani, a Corsican chemist. Mariani's Vin Mariani, a Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves, was a massive international success, held by popes, queens and presidents for its revitalizing properties. Pemberton, always the businessman, simply saw Mariani's success and decided he could do it better, or at least more locally into a different specification. He set up his home laboratory, conducting endless experiments in beakers and glass flasks. This is where the story gets its first truly quirky tidbit. Pemberton didn't just stop at coca and other stimulating ingredients. His early concoctions, known as Pemberton's globe flower syrups, featured all sorts of experimental components, including, and this is a real head-scratcher, extracts from the globe flower Trollius europaeus, a plant whose medicinal properties were, shall we say, significantly less understood than coca, and which Pemberton hoped would have some proprietary nerve cap numbing effect. He was truly throwing everything but the kitchen sink into his remedies. The goal was always the same: a non-addictive nerve tonic that provided an uplifting analgesic effect. The year is 1885, and Pemberton is perfecting his version of Mariani's idea. He combined a powerful coca extract with another potent stimulant, the cola nut, Cola acuminata. The cola nut, native to West Africa, was known for its high caffeine content, and its bitter flavour was often used in traditional ceremonies and as a medicinal chew. Pemberton recognised that the nut's bitterness could complement the complex vegetal notes of the coca. He was chasing a synergy, the coca providing the euphoria and pain relief, and the cola nut providing a jolt of pure energy. He intended for this product to be marketed directly to the sophisticated, often affluent consumers of the time, who could afford patent medicines and who were desperate for relief from their nervous complaints. You can almost hear his sales pitch in your mind's ear, delivered in a refined southern drawl, a restorative for the intellectual worker, a remedy for the delicate constitution. But the exact nature of this early blend, how much coca, how much cola, and how much sugar and flavouring, is a matter of intense historical scrutiny. Historians still argue whether Pemberton was primarily seeking a morphine cure or simply leveraging the latest pharmaceutical craze for profit, which really gets to the core of his initial motivation. Was he a suffering veteran genuinely seeking a safer alternative, or a cynical chemist cashing in on the popular appetite for quick fixes? The truth is likely a blend of both. The greatest entrepreneurial successes often emerge from a personal necessity that happens to align perfectly with the market demand. He had a drug problem, and he saw a way to monetize his way out of it, creating a cure that was, to be perfectly frank, still a powerful psychoactive drug in its own right. The fact that the initial product contained alcohol further complicated this, placing it squarely in the category of a feel-good, mildly intoxicating cure-all. You see, the first version of this world-famous drink wasn't a soda. It was the next logical step in a long line of alcoholic elixirs, soon to be named Pemberton's French Wine Coca. The stage was set for a dramatic and unexpected pivot that would change the whole game. The next time you see a soft drink bottle, remember that what started as a desperate veteran's morphine substitute, a potent, unregulated pharmaceutical wine, was about to be launched into a world that wasn't quite ready for its incredible power or its scandalous secret. The morphine withdrawal must have been a living hell, a constant gnawing presence you couldn't simply wish away. You watch Pemberton, his hands trembling slightly, yet his mind sharp, meticulously mixing his ingredients. He's not just blending a drink, he's engineering his own personal escape route. And that escape route initially ran straight through the heart of European pharmaceutical fashion. We left off with the culmination of his efforts, a high-end wine-based tonic ready for market. He officially launched his product in 1885, not as an American invention, but as a sophisticated European import, a marketing choice intended to lend it an air of refinement and medical authority. He called it Pemberton's French Wine Coca. Now, if you were a wealthy Atlantan in the mid-1980s, desperate for a lift, you would purchase this concoction, and you would be buying an authentic analogue of the European sensation Vin Mariani, which we mentioned earlier. This isn't just a pleasant beverage, it is a pharmaceutical-strength cocktail. You pour a glass and the deep ruby colour of the Bordeaux wine catches the lamplight. The taste is complex, the earthy medicinal bitterness of the coca leaf extract, the dark, slightly metallic note of the cola nut, all smoothed out by the alcohol and maybe a hint of sugar and essential oils. The immediate effect, you realise, is exactly what Pemberton intended. The subtle euphoria of the coca starts to lift the fog, while the wine warms your insides and the cola provides a gentle, energetic buzz. You feel your nervous exhaustion melting away, replaced by a focused, even manic energy. For the upper-class citizen dealing with the stresses of modern commerce, or the Victorian lady suffering from hysteria, this was nothing short of miraculous. The wine itself was crucial to the formula, not just for flavour, but as a delivery chemical. The alcohol naturally helps to dissolve and extract the psychoactive alkaloids from the coca leaf, ensuring a potent and consistent dose in every glass. This is the mainstream historical fact we need to focus on. In the 19th century, alcoholic elixirs were the default form for delivering powerful plant medicines, and the belief in the healing power of wine, especially mixed with botanicals, stretched back to antiquity. Pemberton was simply operating within a completely accepted medical paradigm. It was a time when the lines between medicine, alcohol, and mild intoxication were not only blurred, but practically erased. However, the specific content of his formula pushed the envelope even for that permissive era. The average dose of Pemberton's wine coca, according to some analysis, contained an equivalent amount of psychoactive material that would make a modern regulator faint. It was essentially a cocaine-laced wine. This fact highlights a truly quirky tidbit of the era. In the 1880s, before its addictive nature was widely understood, cocaine was not treated as a dangerous narcotic. It was embraced as a therapeutic miracle. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, was among its most vocal champions, recommending it for everything from depression and digestive disorders to, ironically, morphine addiction. Pemberton was riding a wave of medical enthusiasm, not engaging in back-alley drug pushing. His product was sold openly, legally, and with the endorsement of medical authorities. You look at the advertising materials of the time, and they don't whisper about the coca, they shout about it. The early advertisements promoted Pemberton's French wine coca as a nerve tonic and stimulant, a healthful, invigorative, and exhilarating elixir. They targeted literary and professional men, promising to sharpen the mind and restore intellectual vigour. You can picture yourself reading a pamphlet that says, "This wine will make you feel like you just took a refreshing vacation without ever leaving your study." The product was positioned as a sophisticated, intellectual edge, a high-end, feel-good tonic for the discerning palate. But even this legal, lauded status didn't prevent an immediate and utterly chaotic period of ownership and formulation changes. Pemberton was, by all accounts, a brilliant chemist but a terrible businessman. He was too consumed by his addiction and his subsequent attempts to cure it to effectively manage the marketing and distribution of his potentially revolutionary tonic. He started selling small stakes and shares of the formula almost immediately to raise capital, an act that would later become a legal nightmare. You see him in the back of the pharmacy, pouring out a new batch, and he's already negotiating a fraction of the profits for a quick loan. He was essentially selling off a tiny piece of the future, one desperate loan at a time. This financial instability leads us straight to an unresolved historical debate. Historians still argue whether Pemberton's numerous early sales of the formula were due to his crippling morphine dependency, or his general lack of business acumen, or perhaps a combination of both. The transactions were so haphazard that after his death, a legal morass ensued, with multiple people claiming ownership of the secret. The genius of the original idea, the potent combination of coca and cola, was almost lost in the chaos of Pemberton's financial ruin. Think about the sheer nerve of selling something this powerful over the counter. You, the customer, are buying a pharmaceutical preparation that promises to cure your ailments, lift your spirits, and enhance your productivity, and it's delivered in a bottle of nice French wine. It's a perfect microcosm of the Gilded Age: wealth, indulgence, medical optimism, and an utter disregard for long-term health consequences. The tonic was a success in Atlanta society, precisely because it delivered on its promises, giving users a palpable, noticeable boost of energy and well-being. But that success was confined to a niche market, people who drank wine and sought out patent medicines. It was an expensive, somewhat unwieldy product, and it needed a dramatic overhaul to become the mass-market icon we know today. The wine coca was popular, but it wasn't scalable in the way Pemberton, or rather the men who would later buy him out, needed it to be. The logistical challenges of procuring and maintaining a supply of quality wine, combined with the cost, kept it out of reach for the common man. It was a luxury product. But fate, in the form of local temperance movements, was about to intervene, providing the external pressure needed to force Pemberton to completely reimagine his product. The laws of Atlanta were about to change, and that change would require the pharmacist to pour his potent Coca-Cola mixture out of the wine bottle and into something entirely new, something that would define the American beverage industry forever. You realize that without a local political decision to ban alcohol, the world might never have known Coca-Cola as a soft drink. It would have remained a footnote in the history of Victorian-era cocaine-laced wines. The pivot was not a marketing masterstroke, it was a desperate law-mandated scramble for survival. You are witnessing a commercial death sentence being signed. yet it is also the accidental birth certificate of a global phenomenon. Pemberton's French wine coca was a local hit, but its very foundation, the wine, was about to be yanked out from under it. The moralizing winds of temperance, which had been building momentum across America, finally swept into Atlanta, Georgia. In 1886, the city voted to enact local prohibition. This wasn't nationwide prohibition, just a municipal mandate, but for Pemberton, it was an existential crisis. Overnight, his successful high-end tonic, a wine coca, became illegal to manufacture and sell within the city limits. You can imagine the frantic scramble in his pharmacy, bottles of his expensive elixir, sitting on the shelf, now worthless contraband. This regulatory shock is the single most important pivot in Coca-Cola's history. It's a perfect example of how often massive business success is born not from brilliant planning, but from forced, desperate adaptation. Pemberton had no time for gradual reformulating. He needed an immediate, non-alcoholic substitute that could still deliver the mood-lifting and stimulating properties that made his wine so popular. He had to pivot from a pharmaceutical wine to a pharmaceutical syrup. His solution was to remove the alcohol and replace it with a combination of sugar, water, and carbonation. This shift required him to intensify the flavour profile and the physical kick to compensate for the missing wine. He worked quickly, mixing the coca leaf extract and cola nut extract with simple sugar syrup, and then, crucially, he took it to the soda fountain. This brings us to a key mainstream historical fact. The soda fountain was the epicenter of American social and medical life in the late 19th century. Far from being places of mere leisure, these fountains were essentially the public face of the pharmacy, dispensing everything from digestive aids to headache cures, all mixed with effervescent carbonated water. Pharmacists like Pemberton were the original mixologists, and carbonated water itself was widely believed to possess therapeutic qualities. It was sold as an aid to digestion and a restorative for the nerves, often referred to as soda water or mineral water. You watch as Pemberton, perhaps a bit ragged and certainly pressured, takes his experimental syrup to Jacob's Pharmacy, the largest and most prominent soda fountain in Atlanta, owned by his associate Willis Venable. The syrup was initially intended to be mixed with still plain water, but on that fateful day, often cited as May 8, 1886, it was mixed with carbonated water. The exact circumstances are murky. Is it a deliberate stroke of genius, or a simple mistake by the soda jerk, who just happened to pull the wrong tap? Regardless, the result was immediately electrifying. You lift a glass of this new mixture to your lips. The effervescence provides a refreshing, sharp bite that the still wine never possessed. The sweet syrup, mixed with the bubbly water, delivers the potent, almost medicinal flavour of the coca and cola, but in a far more palatable and invigorating way. The carbonation itself amplifies the stimulating sensation, delivering the potent, now sweetened mixture quickly into your system. It was an instant hit with the soda fountain patrons, who were looking for a temperance-friendly alternative to their usual alcoholic refreshments. The product now had a broader, non-sectarian appeal. It was something everyone could try. Pemberton knew he had something fundamentally new. It was no longer just a local variant of a European wine tonic. It was a uniquely American, effervescent pharmaceutical beverage. He needed a new name that reflected the two primary potent ingredients. This is where the story flows straight into the territory of naming, which we'll cover more in the next section. But for now, the transition to the non-alcoholic syrup cemented the two core elements into the name, Coca-Cola. The hyphen was present in the earliest iterations, a small detail that would later be dropped, but the message was clear. This drink was a blend of coca and cola. But here is where a profound, yet often overlooked quirky tidbit surfaces. The initial success of the non-alcoholic syrup likely masked a significant reduction in the psychoactive effects compared to the wine. Alcohol is a far more efficient solvent than simple syrup and water for extracting the potent alkaloids from the coca leaf. By switching, Pemberton actually made the formula less potent in its raw form. Yet, the addition of carbonation, high amounts of sugar, and the novelty of the experience meant that the sensation of vitality, the kick, was still very much present, or at least perceived to be present. The product's power began shifting from pure pharmacology to a combination of taste, carbonation, and aggressive suggestion. It was an effective workaround that allowed the feeling to persist, even as the raw drug content may have technically dipped. This frantic reformulation leads to one of the most intense historical disagreements regarding the early days of the syrup. Historians still argue whether the removal of alcohol was an immediate and complete break from the coca leaf's medicinal purpose, or simply a calculated business move to sidestep prohibition laws. Given Pemberton's personal history with morphine addiction, some argue he saw the chance to create a mass-market safer alternative, while others contend it was purely economic opportunism. What we do know is that the change immediately unlocked a massive new market, the soda fountain patron who is either already temperance-minded or simply seeking a non-alcoholic refreshment. The transition from a bottled, expensive wine to an on-demand, affordable syrup mixed at the fountain was a game-changer for scale. You could get a glass for 5 cents, a price point that was accessible to nearly everyone, transforming it from a niche medicine for the affluent to a potential mass-market commodity. Pemberton was now selling an experience, a syrupy, bubbly, invigorating 5-cent pick-me-up, rather than just a medicine. The final element of this transformation was the syrup's secrecy. Pemberton was a chemist, and chemists protected their formulas with their lives. The new syrup was mixed in large quantities and then distributed to soda fountains in barrels. Only Pemberton and a few trusted associates knew the exact blend of essential oils, spices, and extracts that went into creating the final distinctive flavour. This intentional veil of secrecy was vital, as it ensured that even if competitors could mimic the Coca-Cola base, they couldn't replicate the unique, highly desirable flavour profile. You can almost feel the weight of that secret, the carefully guarded papers locked in a safe, representing the keys to a potentially massive fortune. Pemberton's accidental success proved one crucial lesson. The American public loved the taste and the feeling of this new, temperance-friendly tonic. The local prohibition law that threatened to destroy his business ended up being the very catalyst that propelled his product out of the medicinal wine niche and onto the path of becoming the world's most popular soft drink. The product was stripped of its wine, but it retained its potency, in both its chemical composition and its psychological draw, and it was now perfectly positioned for mass consumption. The stage was set for the next chapter, capitalizing on the potency of the ingredients and creating an unforgettable brand identity. Now that Pemberton's wine is out of the picture and the new syrup, dubbed Coca-Cola, is bubbling merrily at Jacob's Pharmacy, you must zero in on what exactly you were drinking. This isn't just about a switch from alcohol to carbonated water. It's about the potent, unregulated core of the product. The transition to the syrup didn't mean a move away from its drug-based identity. In fact, the initial marketing doubled down on the therapeutic power of the active ingredients. You've got your 5 cents on the marble counter, and the soda jerk is pulling the lever, mixing a precise, or perhaps not so precise, shot of the dark syrup with the fizzy water. The drink you are consuming is a powerhouse of stimulants. It is vital to understand that in these early days, the formulation was incredibly liberal and crucially unregulated. There were no FDA guidelines, no detailed labeling requirements, and no legal restrictions on the amount of psychoactive substances one could include in a general tonic. Pemberton was his own pharmaceutical regulator, and his chief concern was creating a product that demonstrably worked, that is, a drink that gave the user a noticeable, powerful sense of well-being and energy. The primary ingredients, as the name makes plain, were coca extract and cola nut extract. In the 1880s, the process for making the extract was relatively crude. Pemberton was using an extract derived from fresh coca leaves, which contained significant, measurable amounts of the alkaloid cocaine. While the exact verifiable formula remains the world's most guarded trade secret, historical evidence and later legal testimonies suggest that an average serving of Coca-Cola syrup contained roughly 9 milligrams of cocaine per glass. To put that in perspective, 9 milligrams is a noticeable dose. It's certainly not a street drug level hit, but it is enough to give you a genuine physiological lift, a slight euphoria, a clarity of mind, and a sense of enhanced energy. You would walk away from the soda fountain feeling distinctly better than when you walked in. The cocaine acted as the potent mood elevator, a mild analgesic, targeting the nervous exhaustion that everyone seemed to be suffering from. This powerful effect is the mainstream historical fact that most people find difficult to reconcile with the modern image of the brand. Coca-Cola was not just flavoured with coca, it delivered a chemical experience. Now let's look at the other half of the equation, the cola nut. This tropical nut is a natural source of high amounts of caffeine. Pemberton included it not just for its unique bitter flavour, but specifically for its stimulating properties. The caffeine provided a sustained energy kick that worked synergistically with the immediate rush from the cocaine. The two chemicals were a dynamic duo, the cocaine providing the instant mental boost and the caffeine providing the enduring physical stamina. Here is a truly quirky tidbit about the cola nut portion. Early suppliers of cola nut to the fledgling Coca-Cola company were often inconsistent in their processing, leading to significant variations in the caffeine content from batch to batch. The process of extracting the flavour and stimulant from the nut was still being refined, meaning that the strength of your 5-cent soda could vary wildly depending on the specific barrel of syrup the soda jerk was tapping into that day. We could get a gentle buzz one afternoon and a full-blown jittery rush the next. This inconsistency was a feature of many patent medicines, but in Coca-Cola's case, it added an element of unpredictability to the consumer experience. Pemberton's strategy, whether conscious or desperate, was a brilliant piece of proto-marketing. The sweetness of the syrup masked the harsh medicinal bitterness of the extracts, and the carbonation made it refreshing and fun. But the real loyalty was built on the chemical reward. The consumer associated the distinctive taste, the cold effervescence, and the 5-cent price with a guaranteed feeling of uplift. He felt better every time. The amount of sugar in the early syrup also played a crucial, often overlooked role. The syrup was intensely sweet, necessary both to counter the bitterness of the cola and to deliver a massive sugar rush. This is a triple-layered stimulant effect, cocaine, caffeine and sugar, all hitting your system simultaneously in a pleasant, cold and fizzy delivery system. You realise, as you drain the glass, that this is the perfect tonic for an industrialising society that demanded alertness and productivity. It was a liquid solution to the endemic fatigue of the new working world. The problem, of course, was the lack of standardisation and quality control, which leaves us to a key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Pemberton's dosage was intentionally high to ensure addictive qualities, or if it was simply a reflection of the acceptable high concentrations of active ingredients common in all late 19th century pharmacy products. The line between habit-forming medicine and simple refreshment was dangerously thin, and Pemberton was standing right on it. The fact that he was trying to cure a morphine addiction with a product containing another powerfully addictive substance, cocaine, speaks volumes about the era's pharmaceutical naivete, or perhaps its sheer recklessness. This casual inclusion of potent ingredients created an immediate, almost cult-like following. It wasn't just a thirst quencher, it was a performance enhancer. Students used it to study, labourers used it to power through long shifts, and the urban middle class relied on it to combat the ubiquitous nerves. The powerful effects were the engine of its early growth, propelling it far beyond the local Atlanta market. The product's potency was its key selling point, a secret whispered among satisfied customers. As the product's fame grew, the dangers became more apparent. But for now, in the late 1880s, you simply enjoy the clean, powerful and totally legal buzz. The next crucial step in its journey wasn't about the ingredients, however. It was about giving this potent formula an identity that would stick for centuries. Pemberton might have created the potion, but the potion still needed a powerful, unforgettable name and a look that would make it iconic. That credit belongs not to the chemist, but to a man whose job was to keep the books straight, a man with a genius for calligraphy and branding. He's the one who looked at the two key ingredients and realised the power of alliteration, creating one of the most famous brand names in human history. The syrup is potent, the effects are undeniable, but it still lacks a cohesive identity. Pemberton, the brilliant but chaotic chemist, has created the concoction. Now, the unsung hero of branding steps forward. You watch the ledger as Frank Mason Robinson, Pemberton's bookkeeper and trusted partner, meticulously tallies the initial modest sales figures. Robinson wasn't a scientist, he was an artistic counterpoint to Pemberton's frantic genius. He was a meticulous man who dealt in numbers, but he possessed an eye for aesthetics and the fundamental understanding of how to make something stick in the public consciousness. Robinson understood that a product defined solely by its medicinal ingredients was temporary. To achieve longevity, it needed a catchy name, and a memorable visual identity. He looked at the two key components that gave the drink its character and power, the coca leaf and the cola nut. The name Pemberton's French wine coca was already obsolete, too long, too European, and now, thanks to prohibition, too inaccurate. Robinson decided to fuse the two core ingredients into a single, highly resonant phrase. You can picture him at his desk, scratching his head with the back of his pen, thinking aloud. Coca-Cola? A little clumsy. Cola-Coca doesn't roll off the tongue. He finally landed on Coca-Cola. The alliteration was smooth, musical, and inherently memorable. The twin C sounds were punchy and playful, a world away from the stuffy, medicinal naming conventions of the era. The name itself promised a double dose of exotic, stimulating ingredients, subtly nodding to the powerful effects you'd feel after drinking it. This decision to prioritize rhythm and memorability over descriptive prose is a key mainstream historical fact in the history of advertising. Robinson was laying the groundwork for modern branding, recognizing that how a product sounds is just as important as what it is. But Robinson didn't stop at the name. As a talented amateur calligrapher, he realized the name needed a unique visual signature that no competitor could easily copy. He grabbed a pen, specifically a dipping pen, and began practicing a distinct flowing script. He opted for the Spencerian script, a highly popular, elegant form of penmanship taught in American schools during that era. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and, crucially, difficult to replicate without practice. You see him flourish the letters, making the two capital C's dance together, linked by a hyphen, creating a sense of movement and seamless flow. The resulting Coca-Cola logo, written in the very hand of the bookkeeper, is arguably the most enduring commercial logo in history. It wasn't designed by a high-priced agency. It was a spontaneous act of creative bookkeeping. This is a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The world's most recognizable logo was created by a pharmacist accountant who just happened to be good at cursive. The script gave the product an air of permanence and authority, making it look established and respectable, even though it was brand new and contained a Schedule II narcotic. The flowing script made it feel friendly, accessible, and less clinical than the block lettering used for other patent medicines. With the name and logo set, Robinson became the fledgling company's first advertiser and marketing genius. He personally wrote the first advertisements, which were simple but effective. The very first ad, run in the Atlanta Journal on May 29, 1886, famously used the tagline, "Coca-Cola, delicious, refreshing, exhilarating, invigorating." Notice the heavy emphasis on the feeling, exhilarating and invigorating, which were clear nods to the effects of the Coca and Cola. He placed the advertisements near news articles and editorial content, subtly implying that the drink was as essential to civic life as the daily news. Robinson also pioneered a key marketing strategy that would become a hallmark of the company, ubiquity through visual identity. He began having the logo painted on oilcloth signs, then on tin signs, and eventually on calendars, serving trays, and decorative materials. He understood that simply seeing the name Coca-Cola everywhere would normalize the drink and embed it into the urban landscape. You would see the distinctive script painted on the side of a building, stenciled on the back of a barrel, or printed on a newspaper coupon. However, the rapid branding success coincided with Pemberton's accelerating decline. His health was failing, and his dependency on morphine persisted, despite his creation of a potential substitute. The financial chaos we touched on earlier intensified. Pemberton began selling off more and more shares of the formula, desperate for cash to fund his drug habit and his failing health. He sold 1/3 of the formula to a man named Willis Venable, the owner of Jacob's Pharmacy, and another third to George Lowndes. He even sold portions to Robinson himself. The secret was being parcelled out like small, valuable tracts of land. This brings us to a significant and often debated point in the company's earliest days. Historians still argue whether Robinson, in those crucial early days, was an active partner, or merely a bookkeeper who happened to be present at the creation, and opportunistically purchased a stake in a failing venture. His commitment to the brand identity, the name, the logo, the early advertising, suggests a deeper investment than a mere employer. He was the one with the vision to see the product not as a pharmacy tonic, but as a universally marketable brand. By the summer of 1887, Pemberton was selling his remaining interest to various Atlanta businessmen, including the man who would truly launch the company into the stratosphere, Asa Griggs Candler. Pemberton died a year later, in August 1888, largely penniless, his genius obscured by addiction, buried in an unmarked grave. He never saw the global triumph of his creation, nor did he fully grasp the significance of the beautiful cursive script his bookkeeper had invented. The tragic reality is that the visionary chemist who created the formula died addicted and broke, while the man who named it, Frank Robinson, managed to secure his financial stake, but still needed the shrewd business acumen of a third party to consolidate the ownership and unleash the product's full potential. The stage was now set for the transition from a pharmacist proprietary tonic to a corporate behemoth. The chaotic multi-owner environment left behind by Pemberton would require a ruthless, focused businessman to wade through the legal mess and seize complete control. That man, Asa Candler, was already waiting in the wings, armed with a clear vision and a deep pocket. The future of Coca-Cola now depended entirely on his ability to consolidate all those scattered legal claims into a single, ironclad ownership. The chaos of Pemberton's final years left the Coca-Cola formula scattered across several hands like a deck of poorly dealt cards. Enter Asa Griggs Candler, a man who possessed the financial acuity and ruthless ambition that Pemberton entirely lacked. You watch Candler now, a former drugstore apprentice and now a successful, well-connected pharmacist and businessman in Atlanta. He had already established his own success in the proprietary medicine market, selling his own line of elixirs, and he recognized the raw, explosive potential of Pemberton's Coca-Cola syrup far better than its creator ever did. Kendall's defining attribute was his relentless focus on consolidation. He saw that the product's genius would be completely diluted and lost in legal battles if the ownership remained fractured. He set about, methodically and quietly, buying up every stray fraction of the Coca-Cola formula in business. You can picture him seated in his office, pen in hand, negotiating with the various claimants, Willis Venable, George Lowndes, and even Frank Robinson, all of whom had purchased sticks from a desperate Pemberton. The process was an absolute legal and commercial nightmare, stretching over several crucial years following Pemberton's death in 1888. The most significant of these transactions was the purchase of the formula from Pemberton's son, Charles Alderton Pemberton, known as Charlie. Charlie, unfortunately, inherited his father's struggle with addiction and was in no financial position to manage the asset. Candler essentially used Charlie's need for ready cash to acquire the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. This deal, completed in 1891, is the moment that Candler gained near total, undisputed control. This consolidation phase reveals a key mainstream historical fact. The price of the world's most valuable non-alcoholic beverage formula was, in total, shockingly low. Historians estimate that Candler spent less than $2,300 to purchase the complete rights to the formula, the name, and the burgeoning business assets. You realize that a product now worth billions was acquired for the equivalent of a decent used buggy and a mule. This absurdly low price reflects not only Pemberton's desperation, but also the general underestimation of the product's non-medicinal mass-market potential at the time. Everyone was focused on the drug component. Candler was focused on the brand and the distribution. Candler's strategy wasn't just about buying the assets, it was about controlling the narrative. Once he had secured the formula, he worked swiftly to establish a single legal entity. He incorporated the business in 1892 as the Coca-Cola Company, marking a formal shift from a proprietary pharmacy tonic to a structured, modern business entity. This move is crucial. It provided a legal shield and allowed him to centralize all decisions regarding manufacturing, advertising, and distribution. Now, here is a particularly quirky tidbit regarding Candler's acquisition. He faced a unique challenge with the recipe itself. Pemberton, being a somewhat haphazard chemist in his final years, reportedly had multiple versions of the recipe floating around, and his personal records were disorganized. Candler and his team had to meticulously cross-reference the various notes and accounts from people like Frank Robinson, to establish a single definitive master formula. They essentially reverse-engineered the chaotic documentation into a singular sacred text. The legend of the secret formula was born out of this post-Pemberton archival necessity, establishing the idea that only a select few knew the true blend of ingredients. Candler was a deeply religious man, an active member of the Methodist Church, and a strict moralist, a fact that seems bizarrely at odds with the product he was selling. He personally opposed the widespread use of patent medicines that contained alcohol in narcotics, yet he was now the sole proprietor of a cocaine-laced tonic. This internal contradiction is what fueled a major historical debate. Historians still argue whether Candler's swift moves to consolidate ownership were primarily motivated by a desire to exploit the formula's stimulant properties for massive financial gain, or if he genuinely intended, from the very beginning, to clean up the ingredients and transform it into a harmless temperance drink. The actions he took in the years immediately following his acquisition, namely, keeping the coca extract while simultaneously promoting temperance, suggest a complex mix of commercial pragmatism and moral guilt. His first major contribution was not to change the formula, but to standardize the preparation. He established a centralized manufacturing process for the syrup, ensuring that every barrel shipped out had the same consistent flavor and, more importantly, the same consistent chemical potency. This consistency was essential for building national brand loyalty. You could go to a soda fountain in Atlanta or Baltimore and get the exact same kick, and the exact same distinctive taste. With the legal and manufacturing groundwork laid, Candler could turn his formidable energy toward marketing. He had secured the product, now he needed to secure the market. He kept Robinson, the brand genius, on board, recognizing the value of the iconic name and logo. The stage was set for a massive expansion, one that would take Coca-Cola from a regional curiosity to a nationally recognized symbol of American enterprise. The era of the quiet pharmacist was over. The era of the shrewd, relentless mogul had begun, and he was ready to make his fortune by selling a perfectly legal but undeniably potent pick-me-up to an increasingly anxious nation. The true power of the brand was about to be unleashed, not through medical journals, but through an avalanche of advertising that would redefine how America consumed commercial products. With the ownership consolidated and the formula standardized, Asa Candler didn't waste a moment. You can feel the energy shift in Atlanta. The quiet, medicinal era is over, replaced by the roar of the nascent American advertising machine. Candler understood that selling a soft drink required a radically different approach than selling a patent medicine. He had the product, he had the taste, and he had the kick. Now he needed to create desire on a mass scale. His strategy was simple but revolutionary: ubiquity and constant, pervasive visual presence. Candler's marketing campaign, launched in the early 1890s, is a mainstream historical fact that laid the blueprint for modern mass-market branding. He focused on getting the Coca-Cola name in front of every pair of eyes in America, and he did it through saturation advertising using novel techniques. The aim wasn't just to inform, it was to saturate the public consciousness to the point of subconscious craving. The first and most effective tool was the free sample coupon. Candler realized that the taste and the effect of Coca-Cola were its best salesmen. He flooded the country with handwritten and printed coupons, redeemable for a free glass of Coca-Cola at any soda fountain. You, the customer, would receive a coupon in the mail, in a newspaper, or simply handed to you on the street. You take it to the nearest fountain, you drink it, you feel the immediate uplift, and the next time you have a 5-cent craving, you remember the satisfaction. It was a brilliant low-cost way to overcome initial consumer skepticism and guarantee a trial purchase. By some estimates, between 1894 and 1913, 1 in every 9 Americans had been given a free glass of Coca-Cola, a staggering metric for the time. This tactic built unparalleled brand loyalty, literally one sip at a time. Beyond the coupons, Candler understood the power of promotional merchandise. He took Frank Robinson's beautiful script logo and slapped it onto everything imaginable. You couldn't walk into a store, a doctor's office, or even a home without encountering the brand. He gave away millions of dollars worth of items, not as gifts, but as perpetual advertisements. Calendars, clocks, trays, urns, and brightly painted oilcloth signs. You see the script on a fan coaling you in the summer heat, on a calendar ticking off the days, and on a serving tray holding your lunch. The brand became woven into the fabric of daily life, transforming from a medicinal product into a cultural staple. This aggressive visual push required massive expenditure, which Candler willingly paid because he knew the return on investment would be economically misused. He mandated that every soda fountain that stocked his syrup must have a distinctive branded look, often providing the fountains themselves in exchange for an exclusive contract. The fountains became mini billboards. The red and white colour scheme, chosen for its vibrancy and visibility, began to dominate the commercial landscape. Here is a wonderful, quirky tidbit about this era's advertising. One of Candler's earliest and most impactful promotional items was a highly stylized calendar featuring popular, often beautiful women drinking Coca-Cola. These images were groundbreaking because they linked the consumption of the product to aspirational concepts like leisure, glamour, and modernity. These women were portrayed as vibrant and full of energy, subtly suggesting that the tonic was the source of their vitality and charm. This move was particularly astute because it successfully marketed a stimulant with psychoactive components to women and children, often avoiding the overt medicinal language of earlier patent Turks and presenting it as a fashionable, wholesome refreshment. The marketing materials, however, still relied heavily on the effects of the active ingredients, even as Candler began subtly easing away from the clinical medicine label. Advertisements promised to soothe your nerves, restore your vitality, and cure that splitting headache. The drink was presented as the perfect antidote to modern life stresses, a rapid, pleasant, and legal pick-me-up. You are buying the feeling, and that feeling, is chemically induced. The sheer scale of this marketing effort raises a crucial debate about Candler's ethics. Historians still argue whether Candler's intense promotional drive was a genuine attempt to establish a high-quality product or a predatory strategy to hook the American public on a highly stimulating, mildly addictive substance for profit. The fact that he was simultaneously a deeply moral, temperance-minded Methodist and the chief purveyor of a cocaine-containing tonic is the core paradox of his character and the company's early success. He would often speak publicly about the virtues of temperance, while his company's ledgers swelled with profits derived from a product whose stimulating power was far beyond that of simple coffee or tea. Candler's success wasn't just about spending money, it was about controlling the distribution. He worked to establish a network of regional sales agents, ensuring that no matter how remote the town, a barrel of Coca-Cola syrup was available at the local drugstore or general store. This push for national penetration meant that the distinct taste and the noticeable lift became a familiar experience coast to coast. The final piece of his marketing genius was the perceived value. By setting the price at a fixed 5 cents per glass, Candler created a sense of dependability and accessibility that lasted for decades. This consistent, low price made the powerful, stimulating drink an affordable luxury for the working class and the middle class alike. You could get your buzz for a nickel, making it one of the most profitable 5-cent items in the country. Candler had successfully turned a desperate pharmacist's pain cure into a ubiquitous, heavily branded, and chemically potent national refreshment, all while setting the stage for the dramatic legal and formulation battles that were inevitably coming down the pike. With Candler's massive advertising push, Coca-Cola was flooding the American consciousness. But the core messaging, though dressed up in glossy calendars and catchy slogans, still leaned heavily on the product's original identity as a medical remedy. You are not just buying a soft drink in the 1890s, you are buying a prescription for modern life. The advertisements were a masterful, if manipulative, blend of refreshment and therapeutic promise, capitalizing on the widespread cultural anxiety about the stresses of the industrial age. The primary target of these early advertisements was the vague but pervasive diagnosis of nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia. This was the Victorian-era catch-all for fatigue, anxiety, depression, and general malaise, particularly common among the white-collar workers, professionals, and middle-class women who found the pace of urban life overwhelming. You, the listener, would read an ad promising relief from dull headaches, neuralgia, and that crushing sense of brain fag. Coca-Cola was explicitly positioned as a brain tonic and nerve tonic. a claim directly supported by the presence of powerful psychoactive ingredients. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. The drink's initial success was built on its reputation as a genuine, albeit proprietary, medicine. The company's marketing literature was filled with testimonials, often entirely fabricated or heavily solicited, from people claiming that Coca-Cola had cured their chronic headaches, settled their stomachs, and most importantly, restored their vim and vigor. You'd see a picture of a haggard-looking man or a pale woman, followed by a photo of them looking vibrant and happy, with the caption attributing the transformation entirely to the tonic. The strategy linked the distinctive taste and the fizzy sensation with genuine felt relief. The genius was that the drink did deliver a palpable, stimulating effect thanks to the cocaine and high caffeine content, so the customers, at least initially, felt the claims were truthful. Candler and his team were very careful, however, to tread a fine line. They avoided the explicit, sensational language used by the most outlandish patent medicine peddlers. They didn't claim to cure cancer or tuberculosis, but focused on the socially acceptable, everyday complaints of the middle class. The messaging was sophisticated. This wasn't just a harsh-tasting drug. It was a delicious and refreshing way to take your medicine. The shift from medicine to tonic to refreshment was a deliberate, gradual softening of the messaging, designed to expand the market while still leveraging the drug's effectiveness. But the drink's medicinal claims, and particularly its stimulating properties, created a quirky tidbit that was a PR nightmare for the company: the association of Coca-Cola with the rise of cocaine use among the poor and marginalized. As the product became more widely available and affordable, it began to be used by those seeking a cheap, legal stimulant. In the late 1890s, police reports in some southern cities began to link the consumption of Coca-Cola to increased excitability or erratic behavior, particularly among the black population, a connection often fueled by racist fears and sensationalized media reports of cocaine fiends. The company vehemently denied any link, but the association of their popular product with a drug that was beginning to be viewed as a social menace was a significant problem, forcing Candler to confront the darker side of his product's success. This growing public perception of the drug content in the product, even with the slick marketing, led to an internal conflict within the company that would define the next 2 decades. Historians still argue whether Asa Candler was already planning to quietly remove the cocaine from the formula even before public outcry began, or if the legal and social pressures were the sole catalysts for the change. Given his moralistic background and his desire for the brand to be seen as a clean, wholesome family drink, it's plausible that he saw the drug content as a necessary evil for the product's launch, but an intolerable liability for its future growth. He couldn't build an American icon on a foundation of a growing social problem. The medicinal claims also served a practical business purpose. They justified the drink's initial premium price and its unique positioning. In a world full of simple sugar waters, Coca-Cola stood out because it worked. You could buy a flavored soda for 3 cents, but you paid 5 cents for Coca-Cola because it offered that discernible, potent lift. The initial success was built on the chemical promise. The lasting success would depend on whether the company could maintain the illusion of that promise after the key ingredient was removed. You can trace the evolution of the medicinal claims by tracking the brand slogans. From the very specific, cures headache and exhaustion of the 1880s, the company gradually softened the language to phrases like the great national temperance drink, and finally, the pause that refreshes. The transition is a mirror image of the company's internal struggle. How to move from being a patent medicine that happened to taste a refreshment that still delivered a noticeable feeling of well-being. All while navigating the rapidly shifting tides of American drug regulation. The era of casual drug inclusion in tonics was drawing to a close, and Coca-Cola, by far the most successful of the coca-containing elixirs, was about to become the prime target of a new wave of consumer protection and anti-drug sentiment. The company's success had made it too visible, too ubiquitous, and therefore too vulnerable to the rising tide of scrutiny. That scrutiny, initially a whisper, was about to become a roar. The success of Coca-Cola, propelled by Candler's aggressive marketing, was ironically the very thing that made it a glaring target. By the turn of the 20th century, the product was no longer a regional curiosity. It was a national phenomenon, and its fame drew the intense and critical gaze of a newly awakening public health consciousness. You feel the atmosphere of the country shifting from the permissive anything-goes attitude of the Victorian era to one of progressive reform and scientific skepticism. The age of the unregulated patent medicine was rapidly drawing to a close, and Coca-Cola, with its potent active ingredients, was squarely in the crosshairs. The scrutiny came from several directions simultaneously. First, there was the growing medical understanding of cocaine's addictive nature. You remember how it was initially hailed as a miracle cure, even for morphine addiction. But by the late 1890s, the medical community, particularly in the Deep South where its abuse became more prevalent, had recognized its devastating potential. This realization is a major mainstream historical fact. The scientific and public consensus on cocaine shifted dramatically from therapeutic wonder to dangerous narcotic in a very short period. This consensus meant that any product whose name boasted of its coca content was now viewed not as a cure, but as a potential gateway to addiction. Second, the most vocal criticism came from the burgeoning temperance and women's groups. These moral reformers, often highly educated and politically active, were outraged by the marketing of a stimulating, habit-forming product to women and children. Candler's brilliant marketing, which featured beautiful women enjoying the drink, now backfired. The reformers argued that the consumption of Coca-Cola was contributing to nervous conditions rather than curing them, and that its stimulating kick was an artificial, immoral prop for daily life, essentially a new, hidden form of intemperance. They were concerned that mothers were unwittingly giving their children a mild narcotic every time they visited the soda fountain. Third, the press and yellow journalism seized upon the sensational aspects of the story. Newspapers ran lurid, often racially charged stories linking dope fiends and minor crimes to the consumption of dope sodas like Coca-Cola. While often baseless and exaggerated, these reports fueled public fear and put immense pressure on Candler to address the ingredients. You're at a headline now that screams about the perils of the popular soft drink, and the fear is palpable. This rising criticism created a fascinating and deeply hypocritical, quirky tidbit in the company's internal response. Candler, the deeply devout Methodist, began issuing public statements emphasizing the purity and wholesomeness of Coca-Cola. Even as his chemists continued to use the active coca extract, he tried to appeal to the moralistic segment of the market by emphasizing the beverage's non-alcoholic temperance status, hoping this virtue would outweigh the growing scandal over the joke content. He effectively tried to separate the brand's image from its chemical reality through sheer force of public denial and moralizing rhetoric. He'd talk about the virtue of the drink while fully knowing the chemical secret in the syrup barrels. The fact that the company still maintained the name Coca-Cola during this period of increasing scrutiny is itself a subject of debate. Historians still argue whether Candler kept the name primarily due to the established brand equity Frank Robinson had built, or if it was an intentional, subtle signal to the early loyal consumers that the product still contained the original, powerful ingredients they had come to expect. To change the name would have been to admit guilt and lose decades of recognition. To keep it was to endure a constant barrage of negative press. Candler chose to endure, banking on the brand's immense popularity to outlast the criticism. The growing public distrust meant that the company faced not just bad press, but the threat of genuine governmental action. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency ushered in the progressive era, a time dedicated to cleaning up industry and protecting the consumer. The movement for federal regulation of food and drugs was gaining unstoppable momentum, spearheaded by tireless advocates like Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist of the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry, the precursor to the FDA. Wiley's Poison Squad experiments were demonstrating the dangers of food additives in unregulated patent medicines, and his sights were firmly set on beverages that contained addictive stimulants. Candler knew the clock was ticking. He realized that no amount of free calendars or catchy slogans could protect the company from the full force of the federal government once the first comprehensive food and drug laws were enacted. He understood that for Coca-Cola to survive and reach its ultimate goal of global dominance, it had to be seen as unimpeachably safe. The very thing that had made the drink famous, its potent stimulant kick, was now its greatest liability. The decision, though painful, was clear. The active cocaine component had to go. The gradual internal steps to remove or significantly reduce the drug began in the very early 1900s, marking the beginning of the end for the liquid cocaine era. This was not a voluntary act of corporate goodwill. It was a preemptive strike against impending regulation, a necessary defensive measure taken to preserve a far greater empire. The heat was on. You feel the pressure mounting on Asa Candler's empire a pressure driven by reformers, journalists, and the nascent federal regulatory machine. The name Coca-Cola had become both a blessing and a curse. While the brand recognition was unparalleled, the first half of the name now invoked images of addiction and social decay, threatening to undo a decade of explosive growth. Candler, ever the pragmatist, knew that the drug content was the single greatest vulnerability of his company. Survival demanded change, and that change began with a subtle yet profound reformulation. Around 1900, the company undertook the first significant and crucial step toward cleaning up the recipe: the reduction of the active cocaine content. This wasn't a sudden, complete removal. It was a gradual, pragmatic reduction. Candler's chemists, operating under immense secrecy, began using less of the crude coca extract and started exploring alternative extraction methods. The goal was simple: keep the distinctive, complex flavor profile derived from the coca leaf, but minimize the psychoactive material. This move is a vital mainstream historical fact, often missed in the sensational retelling of the story. Coca-Cola didn't suddenly go from being a powerful drug to a harmless soda overnight. It transitioned through a phase where it contained only trace amounts of the alkaloid. The company, facing the threat of public backlash and legal action, was attempting to hit a sweet spot, maintain enough of the original ingredient to preserve the authentic flavor and a subtle habitual feeling consumers expected, while simultaneously dropping the level low enough to allow Candler to plausibly deny that the drink contained an addictive substance. You can imagine the chemists working with tiny pipettes and sensitive scales, trying to find that exact minimum threshold. The strategy here was one of damage control and forward-thinking branding. By reducing the cocaine, Candler could truthfully tell moral reformers and concerned parents that the drink was practically free of the harmful substance, allowing him to reposition the product as a purer, more wholesome family refreshment. This subtle chemical shift allowed for a massive marketing pivot. The medicinal claims began to fade in favor of simple universal concepts: refreshment, pleasure, and energy. The drink was no longer a cure for nervous exhaustion. It was a reward for hard work. However, reducing the cocaine created a new, complex problem. The euphoria and noticeable high that customers had come to associate with their 5-cent pick-me-up was starting to wane. The product's initial success was built on its potency. Candle needed to replace the power of the missing drug. This leads us to a fascinating, quirky tidbit. To compensate for the diminishing psychoactive effect of the coca, the company began to significantly increase the concentration of the cola nut extract, and consequently, the caffeine content. This was a chemical substitution, a way to maintain the kicks without the liability. The caffeine, a less controversial stimulant at the time, was cranked up to keep the consumers coming back. The company was essentially replacing an illicit drug with a socially accepted one, trading one form of chemical dependence for another. The consumers still got a powerful jolt of energy, it just came from a different source. This period of transition, where the formulation was in flux, fuels a powerful historical debate. Historians still argue whether the phased reduction of cocaine led to a temporary loss of customer loyalty among early consumers who missed the original potency, or if the marketing and caffeine compensation was so effective that the change went largely unnoticed by the vast majority of the consuming public. The company's continued explosive growth suggests the latter, but the transition period must have been nerve-wracking for Candler. He was essentially tampering with a successful product's core efficacy, a calculated risk only undertaken due to the fear of government intervention. This move was a desperate attempt to preempt the most serious threat, the federal government. Candler could see the writing on the wall with figures like Harvey Wiley gaining power. The company needed an ironclad defense, and that defense was a formula so minimal in its narcotic content that it could withstand legal challenge. The complete and final removal of all active traces was not far behind, driven by the realization that trace amounts were still enough to warrant prosecution under the new laws being debated in Washington. The first reduction was a business decision made under duress. It wasn't about public health, it was about protecting the brand's economic future. You watch Candler authorize the change, not with regret over the medicinal qualities of the original, but with the cold, calculating eye of a magnate protecting his investment. The product's potency had given it life, but its toxicity was threatening to kill it. The company was now playing a strategic game of chemical cleanup, hoping to be fully inoculated against the legal storms that were quickly gathering on the horizon. The very name of the product was about to be tested in the nation's highest courts, forcing Candler to take the final, irreversible step to strip the Coca from Coca-Cola. The company's subtle chemical cleanup wasn't fast enough, nor was it absolute enough to escape the eye of the federal government. The tide of scrutiny we discussed earlier finally materialized into tangible legal threats. The early 1900s marked the climax of the progressive movement's fight against corporate malfeasance and unsafe products, and Coca-Cola, despite its massive popularity, was about to be dragged into a landmark legal battle that would forever change its formula and its relationship with the American public. The most pressing and direct threat came from the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1966. This is a central mainstream historical fact, not just for Coca-Cola, but for the history of consumer protection in the United States. Spearheaded by President Theodore Roosevelt and championed by Dr. Harvey Wiley, the Act prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs. For the first time, companies were required to list certain dangerous ingredients including alcohol, cocaine, and caffeine on their labels. While the company had already reduced the cocaine content, the very presence of the word coca in its name and the lingering trace amounts of the alkaloid, plus the enormous amounts of caffeine, made it an immediate target for the reformers. Candler and his legal team were put on the defensive. They had to fight not only the public perception of the cocaine issue, but also the very real threat posed by the Act. They vehemently argued that the cocaine content was negligible, and that the drink was, by that point, purely a refreshment, not a drug. They knew that their early formula was adulterated, but they claimed the refined formula was innocent, betting that the government could not definitively prove otherwise without revealing the company's cherished trade secrets. However, the legal pressure focused just as much on the caffeine. The government's chief chemist, Dr. Wiley, viewed the excessive and unlisted caffeine content as a significant form of adulteration, especially given the drink's popularity among children. He saw Coca-Cola as a stimulant for the masses, one that was habit-forming and potentially detrimental to the public health, even without the heavy dose of cocaine. This focus on caffeine, a substance generally considered safe in moderation, highlights a fascinating quirky tidbit of the era. In the absence of a complete ban on cocaine-laced products, reformers often used the excessive caffeine as an alternative avenue for legal attack. It was a proxy fight against the entire stimulant culture that Coca-Cola represented. You can sense the urgency and panic within the Coca-Cola Company headquarters. Every advertising campaign, every barrel of syrup, was now a potential piece of evidence in a federal investigation. The company faced massive fines, seizures of its product, and a devastating blow to its brand reputation if found guilty of violating the new law. The mere possibility of a successful federal prosecution would open the floodgates for state and local lawsuits, threatening to dismantle the national distribution network Candler had so carefully constructed. This intense legal and scientific scrutiny leads directly to one of the most compelling scholarly disagreements of the entire saga. Historians still argue whether the company's decision to finally and completely remove all active traces of cocaine was driven by the fear of federal prosecution under the 1968 Act, or if it was a necessary business move to protect its emerging bottling contracts and the expansion into international markets, which required an unimpeachable image. The international market in particular was becoming increasingly important, and European countries, which had their own strict food and drug standards, would never have accepted a product that could be legally classified as a narcotic. The company's response to the 1906 Act was to finalize its reformulation process. They realized that trace amounts were not good enough. They needed a formula that was entirely free of the psychoactive alkaloid. This meant changing their sourcing and processing of the coca leaf itself. They couldn't simply stop using coca leaf extract altogether, because the distinct flavor, which they claimed was the true secret, came from the leaf. They needed a technical solution to extract the flavor without the drug. This requirement necessitated a deeper partnership with pharmaceutical suppliers. The company began working with a specialized chemical processing company, which was able to effectively decocainize the coca leaves before they were sent to the Coca-Cola syrup plant. The leaf extract was stripped of its cocaine, which was then sold to pharmaceutical firms for legal use, while the flavorless drug-free residue was what went into the famous syrup. This was the final, definitive step. By 1903, the company had committed to the decocainization process. and by 1904-1905, the complete active removal was largely implemented, making the product essentially drug-free in its psychoactive sense. This chemical change, however, did not stop the government's legal pursuit. Dr. Wiley and his team were not just concerned with cocaine, they saw the caffeine as a problem of equal weight. The stage was set for the climactic legal showdown, the United States v. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, a case that would challenge the very identity of the product and test the limits of the new federal food laws. Candler had won the battle against the reformers, but he was about to face a far more serious war against the American legal system. The fact that the company still maintained the name Coca-Cola was now a bold, calculated risk that the government was ready to exploit. The legal storm was closing in, and the need for an unimpeachable, drug-free formula was paramount. Asa Candler's survival strategy hinged on a technological solution: decocainization. This was the chemical process that allowed the company to perform one of the most brilliant sleights of hand in commercial history, retaining the flavor identity of the coca leaf while stripping away its legal liability. You are about to peek into the highly secretive chemical laboratory where the world's most famous trade secret was refined. This process, which began in earnest around 1903 and was fully implemented by 1905, is a key mainstream historical fact that distinguishes the modern soft drink from its medicinal ancestor. Candler realized he could not simply use synthetic flavors. The unique, complex vegetal notes of the coca leaf were essential to the flavor profile that Frank Robinson had branded. But he also knew he couldn't afford to keep the alkaloid. The solution was to work with the Stearns Chemical Company, and later to establish a long-standing, heavily monitored relationship with the Maywood Chemical Works in Maywood, New Jersey, which eventually became the Stepan Company. You can picture the chemical lab, filled with distillation columns and filtration equipment. The process involved treating the raw coca leaves, which were and still are imported legally under special government permit, with a series of solvents. The goal was to separate the desirable compounds, the flavor essences, from the undesirable ones, the psychoactive alkaloids. The leaves were essentially washed and filtered, allowing the solvents to pull out the cocaine and related alkaloids, leaving the residue, the decocainized coca leaves, behind. This residue, now free of any active narcotic, was then used to make the extract that went into the famous 7X flavor formula. The brilliance of this arrangement was the establishment of a perfect chemical and legal firewall. The Maywood Chemical Works handled the raw, controlled substance, extracted the cocaine for legal medicinal uses by pharmaceutical companies, and only passed the inert, flavor-containing bioproduct to the Coca-Cola Company. Candler no longer touched the drug, he only touched the flavor. This setup provided an ironclad legal defense, allowing the company to truthfully state that the beverage sold to the public contained absolutely no active cocaine. They could maintain that Coca-Cola contains an extract of the coca leaf without admitting to the presence of any narcotic. Here is a truly quirky tidbit about this process. The decocainization was so thorough that the resulting cocaine, which was legally separated and purified at the New Jersey plant, became one of the main sources of pure cocaine for the American pharmaceutical industry during the early 20th century. In a bizarre twist of fate, the Coca-Cola Company, by cleaning up its act, became an indirect facilitator for the legal medical supply of the very drug it was publicly trying to disassociate from. The company was essentially funding its flavor science by selling off the unwanted drug byproduct. This highly secretive, specialized process also reinforced the myth of the secret formula. Candler ensured that the decocainized extract was only one component of the final syrup, which was mixed at headquarters under a veil of extreme secrecy, guarded by only a few executives. This intentional opaqueness was a strategic defense mechanism. If the government or competitors couldn't decipher the full list of ingredients, the precise blend of essential oils and other extracts, they couldn't prove adulteration or duplicate the product. This shift in ingredient sourcing and processing led to a complex legal and marketing problem that remains a historical debate. Historians still argue whether the flavor of Coca-Cola was significantly altered by the complete removal of the active cocaine, and if the consumer base noticed and accepted the change, while the overall taste profile remained the same due to the use of the decocainized leaf. The subtle sensory effects of the narcotic were gone. The company had to rely entirely on the high levels of caffeine and sugar, combined with aggressive advertising, to provide the sought-after exhilarating sensation. The fact that the brand's growth accelerated after the removal suggests that the power of marketing in the compensatory increase in caffeine were more than enough to satisfy the public's desire for a stimulating beverage. The company's lawyers now had their primary defense ready. The product was not a drug, it was a refreshment. Its name was an homage to its heritage, not a description of its current chemical content. But Dr. Wiley and the federal government were not satisfied. They argued that the product was still adulterated because of the excessive caffeine and misbranded because the name Coca-Cola was misleading, implying it contained properties it no longer possessed, and encouraging children to consume a harmful stimulant. This disagreement over caffeine in the product's name would be the central focus of the impending climactic court case that would test the very limits of the new food and drug laws. The decocainization process had secured the formula's survival, but the brand itself was still on trial. The decocainization process had secured Coca-Cola from charges related to a powerful narcotic, but the company's legal battles were far from over. Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, the tenacious chief chemist and head of the newly empowered Bureau of Chemistry, was still determined to regulate the product, focusing his attack on the next most potent ingredient, caffeine. The stage was set for the climactic legal confrontation that would test the limits of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1966, a case known as United States v. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. The action began dramatically in 1969. Federal authorities, acting on Wiley's orders, raided a Coca-Cola warehouse in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and seized 40 barrels and 20 kegs of the prepared syrup. The government's charge was dual. First, that the syrup was adulterated because it contained an excessive, dangerous amount of caffeine, a substance not adequately labelled and therefore potentially harmful, and second, that the product was dubbed, misbranded because the name Coca-Cola was deceptive, implying the presence of coca properties that were no longer chemically active. This federal seizure is a cornerstone mainstream historical fact in the company's history, marking the moment when the government put the entire soft drink industry on notice. The trial itself, which finally went to court in 1911, was a spectacle that pitted the progressive science-driven agenda of the federal government against the powerful commercial interests of the new corporate age. The government called a parade of medical experts, who testified that the copious amounts of caffeine in the syrup, which, remember, had been significantly increased to compensate for the reduction in cocaine, were leading to nervousness, sleeplessness, and general ill health, especially among children who drank the product daily. They argued that a powerful stimulant, even a legal one, should not be masquerading as a harmless refreshment. The defense, led by Coca-Cola's formidable legal team, countered with equal vigor. Their primary argument was a technical one. They claimed the Pure Food and Drug Act was intended to regulate food and drugs, and Coca-Cola, by this point, was simply a beverage, a non-alcoholic, harmless refreshment that fell outside the scope of the new law. They brought in their own experts, who testified that the amount of caffeine in a single serving was less than or equal to that found in a typical cup of coffee or tea, a comparison they relentlessly stressed to normalize the ingredient. This defense strategy highlights a crucial, almost humorous, quirky tidbit of the trial. The government, in an attempt to prove the harmful effects of the caffeine, even brought forth a group of young children who testified about feeling sick or restless after drinking the product regularly. The defense, in turn, subjected these young witnesses to grueling cross-examinations, attempting to prove that the children were simply spoiled or perhaps coached by anti-Coke crusaders, and that the symptoms were unrelated to the beverage. The courtroom became a battleground over the appropriate stimulant intake for America's youth. You can hear the skeptical murmurs of the jury as two grown lawyers grill an 8-year-old on the precise nature of his nervous jitters. The company's defense against the misbranding charge was equally strategic. They argued that the name Coca-Cola was not descriptive of the contents, but was simply a trade name that had acquired massive commercial recognition. The name, they claimed, referred only to the brand identity, not the specific chemical properties of the ingredients. This legal distinction, trade name versus descriptive labelling, was a critical maneuver aimed at protecting the immense value of Frank Robinson's famous script. The initial verdict in the lower court was a decisive win for the government, confirming that the product was indeed adulterated due to the excessive caffeine. The federal court ordered the seized barrels and kegs to be destroyed. This was a massive public relations disaster for Candler. He immediately appealed the decision, taking the fight all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. This protracted legal struggle led to one of the most significant scholarly debates surrounding the company's early ethics. Historians still argue whether the company's fierce legal defense was a principled stand against government overreach or a cynical attempt to protect its right to legally addict consumers to a substitute stimulant after the original drug was removed. Candle's willingness to spend massive amounts of money and legal talent to fight for the right to use high amounts of caffeine suggests that the stimulant kick, regardless of the source, was viewed as essential to the product's continued success and profitability. In 1916, the Supreme Court delivered its final ruling. The court sided with Coca-Cola on the misbranding charge, accepting the company's argument that Coca-Cola was a legitimate trade name, not a misrepresentation of the ingredients. This victory protected the iconic brand identity. However, the court also sent the case back to the lower courts to determine whether the caffeine content was indeed adulteration. Realizing that the government had a strong case on the health effects of excessive caffeine, the company decided to preempt a potentially damaging final ruling. Rather than risk the ultimate legal condemnation, Asa Candler, who by then was focused on selling his controlling interest, agreed to a settlement with the government. The company agreed to immediately and significantly reduce the amount of caffeine in the syrup to a level that was scientifically less controversial. The legal battle of 1909-1916 was ultimately a strategic victory for Coca-Cola. They had successfully defended the brand name, avoided a total ban, and most importantly, secured the right to continue using the decocanized coca leaf extract, preserving the flavor. The cost was a reduced caffeine content, a small price to pay for the survival of the world's most recognizable brand. The era of the heavily dosed pharmaceutical tonic was definitively over, ushered out by the heavy hand of the federal law. The product was finally forced to become what its later advertising claimed it to be, a refreshment, albeit still a caffeinated one. The Supreme Court battle, though a partial legal victory for the Coca-Cola name, ultimately forced a crucial internal concession, a significant reduction in caffeine. You realize that Asa Candler, having won the right to use the name, had to strategically retreat on the ingredient that Dr. Harvey Wiley successfully framed as an adulterant. The caffeine conundrum was the final messy chapter in the drink's transition from a pharmaceutical powerhouse to a mass-market refreshment. This need to address the caffeine level was the direct result of the company's own strategy to compensate for the diminishing returns of the cocaine reduction we discussed earlier. Candler's chemists had shrewdly turned up the dial on the kola nut extract, and thus the caffeine to maintain the product's signature kick. This chemical substitution is a critical mainstream historical fact. The company swapped an illegal narcotic cocaine for an over-the-counter stimulant caffeine to ensure consumer loyalty, proving that the addictive sensation was always a core part of the product's appeal, even as the specific chemical source changed. Following the legal settlement in 1916, the Coca-Cola company had to immediately and demonstrably lower the concentration of caffeine in the syrup. This was done not because of a new health revelation, but purely to satisfy the government and avoid the total ban the lower courts have initially threatened. You can imagine the chemists, once again, working with intense precision to find the new government-approved threshold, the point at which the product was stimulating enough to be enjoyable and habit-forming, but not so stimulating as to be legally classified as an adulterant. The impact of this forced reduction created a fresh crisis of confidence within the company. Would the public notice the difference? Would the loss of that pronounced jittery feeling alienate the loyal customers who relied on Coca-Cola for their midday or morning jolt? The answer, surprisingly, was largely no. This success was due to a brilliant marketing and psychological maneuver. This is where a truly quirky tidbit about the brain comes into play. The perceived lift of the drink was, by this point, heavily driven by habit and expectation. The distinctive taste, the cold effervescence, the massive sugar content, and the 5-cent price. All of these factors had become so deeply ingrained that the ritual of consumption provided almost as much a psychological boost as the chemicals themselves. You were drinking not just a soda, but a powerful cultural symbol, and your brain was conditioned to feel better after that first sip. The company relied on this Pavlovian response to paper over the gaps left by the reduced stimulants. Moreover, the company's advertising became even more effective in selling the idea of refreshment rather than the chemical reality. Slogans began to emphasize feelings of relief and satisfaction. The pulse that refreshes became the central theme, transforming the product from a stimulating tonic to a restorative break from daily life. The focus was shifted from the product's ingredients to its emotional benefit. This forced formulation change leads to one of the most enjoined debates in the product's history. Historians still argue whether the Coca-Cola company's decision to rely so heavily on sugar and flavour after the removal of the major stimulants was a tacit admission that its product was never a health tonic, but simply a brilliantly marketed, highly palatable sugar water, or if the original subtle blend of oils and extracts retained enough uniqueness to genuinely justify its market dominance. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. The flavour was unique, but it required the massive sugar spike and the lingering caffeine to maintain its market edge in the fiercely competitive soda market. Asa Candler, who had been gradually stepping away from the company to focus on other ventures and his political career, he became mayor of Atlanta, ultimately saw his product transformed. He started with a desperate attempt to cure a morphine addiction with a cocaine wine, and he ended with a caffeinated sugar syrup that was legally clean and commercially unstoppable. The legal challenges were a necessary refining fire. They stripped away the liabilities cocaine, excessive caffeine, and left behind a highly profitable, legally defensible, and psychologically addictive mass-market product. The company's greatest post-legal challenge was not the formula itself, but protecting the secrecy of the revised, now-safe formula. They had survived 2 decades of legal attacks on their ingredients, and they realized that their greatest asset was not the product in the bottle, but the knowledge of how to make it. The formula became the central pillar of the brand's mystique, a carefully guarded secret that would be elevated to the level of corporate legend. The company was now ready to pivot from its legal defenses to its cultural dominance, ensuring that the source of its flavour remained an eternal mystery. With the legal battles fought and the controversial ingredients removed or reduced, the company's focus shifted entirely to protecting its greatest remaining asset, the secrecy of the flavour blend. You watch the corporate transition from a defensive legal posture to a strategic myth-making campaign designed to turn a trade secret into an untouchable corporate legend. The company understood that the mystique of the unknown was now more valuable than the chemical potence it once possessed. This intense focus on secrecy is not merely a quirk of the company. It's a brilliant piece of commercial strategy. In the wake of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Supreme Court case, the formula was legally clean, but the brand equity rested on the unique, inimitable taste. If a competitor could replicate the flavour exactly, all of Candler's efforts and all the legal fees would have been for naught. Thus, protecting the formula became an obsession, a ritualistic act of corporate dogma. The centre of this secrecy was the creation of the infamous merchandise 7X. This is a pivotal mainstream historical fact in the narrative of the brand. Merchandise 7X is the term used internally to refer to the concentrated flavour component of the syrup, the carefully guarded blend of essential oils and other flavour extracts that give Coca-Cola its distinctive, complex profile. It is a syrup within a syrup, prepared in a secluded separate apartment at the headquarters, guarded by only a few senior officials. This system ensured that only these select individuals knew the exact measurements and ingredients of this most critical flavour component. You can imagine the procedure. The main syrup is prepared in large vats using the standardized ingredients: sugar, caramel, water, decocainized coca extract, cola nut extract, and phosphoric acid. But the final, distinctive flavour note, merchandise 7X, is added at the last minute by a single trusted individual. This compartmentalization was designed so that no one person, except perhaps the very top executive, would ever possess the complete, usable formula. The knowledge itself was broken into fragments, a deliberate strategy of corporate knowledge management designed to prevent espionage or accidental disclosure. The company elevated the formula's protection to a religious status. The original handwritten formula, which was bought from Pemberton's successors, was allegedly placed in a vault in the Guarantee Bank in Atlanta in 1919 and later moved to the Trust Company Bank. The act of moving and protecting the paper became a public relations event, reinforcing the idea that the secret formula was literally the most valuable substance on Earth. This deliberate air of mystery is a powerful, quirky tidbit. The actual paper the formula was written on was guarded more fiercely than a nation's crown jewels, largely because the belief in the secret was the ultimate guarantor of the brand's exclusivity. The actual chemical recipe, though complex, was less important than the corporate narrative surrounding its protection. This cult of secrecy served multiple functions beyond simple protection. It was a potent defense against future regulation. If regulators couldn't even determine the full list of ingredients, they couldn't possibly classify it as adulterated or misbranded based on one of the minor flavor components. It was a form of preemptive regulatory shielding. The focus on the secret also drove one of the most significant scholarly debates about the product's identity. Historians still argue whether the company's obsessive secrecy was an honest business practice to protect its intellectual property, or if it was a deliberate, cynical marketing tool to mask the fact that the post-cocaine, post-heavy caffeine formula was simply not special enough on its own to warrant its global dominance. By making the formula a mythical secret, the company ensured that the consumer never stopped believing in the magic, even if the magic was now largely psychological and behavioral. This protection of the formula became intrinsically linked to the corporate image, and was a primary reason why the company moved away from its origins as a medicinal tonic. The more they could stress the uniqueness and the mystery of the taste, the less they had to talk about the product's functional effects, which were now substantially reduced. The narrative was simple. You cannot know what makes it taste this good, but you know you crave it. The protection of the formula required more than just vaults and corporate divisions. It required a commitment to absolute consistency. Every bottle, every glass in every city had to taste exactly the same. This uniformity was the true testament to the formula's integrity and the company's quality control. By maintaining this consistency globally, the company was able to leverage the secret not just as a defense mechanism, but as a proactive tool for global brand expansion. They had protected the core flavor, and now they were ready to take that standardized, legally clean, and mysteriously guarded product to the world, shedding the final vestiges of its medicinal identity and fully embracing its future as a global icon of refreshment. The formula was clean, the secret was locked away, and the legal challenges were settled. The task now facing the Coca-Cola company was the final, total pivot, transforming the brand identity from a scandalous form of medicine into a fun, universal refreshment. This was a monumental act of corporate rebranding, a campaign to wipe the slate clean in the public mind and replace the image of a dope soda with the symbol of wholesome American leisure. You watch this transformation unfold, a triumph of marketing over controversial history. The post-cocaine, post-heavy caffeine era demanded a messaging shift from function to feeling. The company began to relentlessly promote the product's refreshment value above all else. This strategic move is a crucial mainstream historical fact. The company moved away from complex medicinal language entirely, adopting simple, emotional, and universally appealing slogans. The pause that refreshes adopted around 1929, though the idea began earlier. First knows no season, and where there's Coke, there's hospitality. Were all designed to decouple the drink from the pharmacy and recouple it with social pleasure, home life, and leisure time. The brand was no longer something you took to cure a headache, it was something you took to enjoy a moment. This required a complete overhaul of the visual identity. The company began associating the drink with images of happy, healthy people engaged in wholesome, aspirational activities. The iconic, slender contour bottle, standardized in 1916, became the vessel of this new identity. The bottle, designed to be recognizable even in the dark or when broken on the ground, became a symbol of uniformity and reliability. You no longer bought a glass of mysterious syrup at the pharmacy. You bought an identifiable, perfectly packaged experience. This standardization of the physical product was essential to the triumph of the brand, guaranteeing that the refreshing experience was identical from one customer to the next. Furthermore, the company leveraged the burgeoning popularity of refrigeration and bottling. While the drink started at the soda fountain, the bottling phenomenon, kicked off by Candler's licensing deals in the late 1890s, was the key to true ubiquity. You see the product moving out of the city drugstores and into small-town general stores, homes, and eventually vending machines. Bottling allowed Coca-Cola to be consumed anytime, anywhere, transforming it from a social on-premise fountain drink to a personal, portable refreshment. This logistical triumph was essential for the psychological pivot from medicine to refreshment. The company's use of holiday advertising provides a particularly quirky tidbit in this rebranding narrative. While not the inventor of the modern Santa Claus image, the Coca-Cola company played a massive role in standardizing and popularizing the image of a large, jolly, red and white clad Santa through its advertising starting in the 1930s. This deliberate association of the brand with the universal, non-controversial joy of Christmas, and a figure who was neither a pharmacist nor a drug user, was a powerful way to cement its image as a wholesome, family-friendly icon. you realize that the company used Christmas cheer to completely sanitize its controversial past. The triumphant rebranding was so successful that it created a historical revisionism that persists to this day. Historians still argue whether the post-1920s rebranding was a genuine reflection of the company's new ethos, or a masterful, sustained act of corporate amnesia designed to bury the inconvenient truth of its drug-laced origins. The continued use of the name, despite the chemical removal, is the biggest piece of evidence for the latter. The company kept the scandalous name but changed the product, daring the consumer to forget the controversy while still buying the promise of the original potent experience. The ultimate triumph of the Coca-Cola brand was its integration into the American identity. During World War II, the company made a strategic, globally defining decision to ensure that every American soldier, no matter where they were stationed, could get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents. This act transformed the brand from an American product into an intrinsic symbol of American life, leisure, and democracy. The drink became a taste of home, a brief sweet escape for millions. This association with patriotism and the American way of life completed the sanitization process, fully overwriting the lingering image of a tonic with a dark secret. By the mid-20th century, Coca-Cola had fully shed its pharmaceutical skin. It was no longer a medicine, a tonic, or a legal liability. It was an icon, a staple of popular culture, and a commercial powerhouse. The journey from a desperation-fueled, cocaine-laced wine to the world's most recognizable beverage stands as one of the most remarkable and successful commercial transformations in history, a testament to the power of marketing and the American public's willingness to forgive, or simply forget, a controversial past. The legal battles surrounding Coca-Cola were not isolated events. They were a microcosm of a much larger seismic shift in American culture. A period stretching back centuries when powerful, often dangerous elixirs were sold openly and legally with fantastic, unregulated claims. Coca-Cola's forced reformulation became a symbol of this transition, demonstrating that even the most successful, most ubiquitous products could not escape the rising demand for truth in advertising and safety in consumption. This shift was driven by a fundamental change in how Americans viewed health and medicine. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the professionalization of medicine. Doctors, chemists, and pharmacists, trained in modern universities, began actively campaigning against the quackery and reckless use of potent drugs inherent in the patent medicine trade. The rise of laboratory science, which could accurately analyze and identify the components of these secret formulas, stripped away the veil of mystery and exposed the harmful substances, opium, morphine, alcohol, and cocaine, that underpinned many popular remedies. The legal crusade against Coca-Cola, led by Dr. Harvey Wiley, was part of this larger movement. His actions weren't just targeting a soda, they were targeting a system of commerce that prioritized profit over public health. The ultimate result of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the subsequent tightening of regulations was a sweeping cleanup of the entire marketplace. This is a vital mainstream historical fact. The law's passage forced hundreds of companies to either reformulate their products, accurately label their contents, or simply go out of business. Products with names like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained morphine and was often given to infants, or various consumption cures often containing alcohol and cannabis, were either pulled from shelves or dramatically changed. The American public could no longer be openly sold narcotics under the guise of medicine. Coca-Cola's survival was unique because of its ability to adapt. While most of its contemporaries either collapsed or faded into obscurity, Candle's empire successfully navigated the treacherous transition by focusing on flavor and refreshment. The company essentially performed a clean break from its peers, exchanging the medical association for a cultural one. You see other companies, often much smaller and less sophisticated, attempting the same pivot, but failing because they couldn't replicate the brand recognition, the distribution network, or the distinctive taste of the Coke formula. This massive cultural cleanup created a truly quirky tidbit in American legal history. For decades after the 1906 Act, there were legal ambiguities about what exactly constituted a drunk versus a food. Companies continually challenged the law, arguing that their tonics or elixirs were simple foods, not subject to the strict labeling requirements for drugs. The long, drawn-out legal fight with Coca-Cola helped set the precedent. confirming that any product making a therapeutic claim or containing a high level of an active ingredient like caffeine could be subject to federal scrutiny. The trial, therefore, didn't just clean up Coca-Cola, it helped define the regulatory landscape for all consumables. The entire experience forces a difficult historical contemplation. Historians still argue whether the patent medicine era, despite its inherent dangers, served a necessary social function by providing accessible, affordable, and often effective, albeit chemically potent, pain relief and mood enhancement to a public that lacked access to professional medical care. For many poor or rural citizens, the local pharmacist's tonic was the only available remedy for pain, and for women especially, these tonics were sometimes the only culturally permissible form of self-meditation for anxiety and stress. Coca-Cola, in its original form, was part of this highly functional, if toxic, system. Its forced transformation symbolizes the victory of organized medicine and government regulation over the chaos and self-reliance of the previous era. By the 1920s, the lingering association of powerful plant extracts and alcohol with medicinal tonics had largely vanished from mainstream American life. The drugstore soda fountain, once a pharmaceutical haven, was firmly cemented as a place of social gathering and harmless refreshment. Coca-Cola, the product that bridged these two eras, had successfully shed its skin, becoming a symbol of the future, standardized, clean, and aggressively marketed, rather than a relic of a dubious past. The ghost of Dr. Pemberton's original addiction cure was finally laid to rest, replaced by the shiny, cheerful, and globally recognizable icon. The final task now is to reflect on this astonishing legacy and the controversial truth that remains at the heart of the world's most enduring brand. You stand at the end of this astonishing historical journey, looking at a chilled bottle of Coca-Cola, and the beverage is no longer a simple refreshment, it is a complex relic. It embodies a narrative of desperation, genius, legal warfare, and marketing triumph. The final reflection is on the improbable legacy of a product that began as liquid cocaine and cola nut, and ended as the world's most recognizable cultural icon. The journey of Coca-Cola is a masterclass in corporate adaptation, a story about how to successfully bury a scandalous past beneath a mountain of pervasive, wholesome marketing. The fact that a product with such a controversial genesis could achieve unparalleled global success is a key mainstream historical fact, and a testament to the power of branding and standardization. Coca-Cola survived because it shed the liabilities of the drug while retaining the distinct flavor and, crucially, the underlying chemical function of being a powerful, cheap, and easily accessible stimulant. The caffeine and the massive sugar content ensured that the habitual feeling of uplift and energy remained, securing the loyalty of a public conditioned to expect a kick from their 5-cent soda. The company achieved the seemingly impossible, selling the world on a cleaned-up version of its own form of ice. The most profound part of the legacy lies in the enduring myth of the secret formula. The company has maintained the narrative of merchandise 7X for over a century, transforming what was once a chaotic pharmacist's notes into an item of global corporate veneration. The secrecy is no longer about preventing competitors from discovering the cocaine. It's about protecting the aura of uniqueness that justifies the brand's dominance and its massive valuation. The secret is the guarantee that no one else can truly make a product that tastes exactly the same, thereby locking in consumer preference. This successful manipulation of corporate secrecy into a marketing asset is a singular achievement. Here is a final quirky tidbit that perfectly encapsulates the legacy. While the company no longer uses active coca leaves, it still legally imports massive quantities of tea cocaine-based coca leaf extract, which is processed by the same company, the Stepan Company, in New Jersey. The product's connection to its infamous past is quite literally maintained in the supply chain to this day, ensuring the continuity of the unique flavor. The company buys the leaf, strips the drug for legal sale elsewhere, and then uses the inert residue for the famous syrup. You realize that every sip you take contains the flavor essence of a formerly narcotic leaf, a final, fascinating chemical whisper of its origins. This enduring yet sanitized connection to its roots leads to the final, most complex scholarly debate of all. Historians still argue whether the lasting global triumph of Coca-Cola represents the ultimate victory of American marketing genius over ethical considerations, or if the brand's adaptability and willingness to comply with public health laws make it an exemplar of corporate responsibility in the face of scientific progress. The answer lies in the nuance. The company was reactive, not proactive, in cleaning up its formula. but its eventual total compliance secured its longevity. The legacy is a blend of ruthless commercial ambition and reluctant pragmatic reform. The ultimate triumph of the Coca-Cola icon is its journey to becoming a global symbol of modernity and cultural exchange. It is served in nearly every country on earth, transcending language, religion, and political ideology. It became the flavor of globalization, a consistent, predictable taste in a turbulent world. The red and white logo, the contour bottle, and the 5-cent price point fixed for decades became anchors of familiarity. The controversy, the addiction, the legal battles, they are all relegated to footnotes in a history that has been overwhelmingly rewritten by saturation advertising and cultural permeation. You look at that iconic script, Frank Robinson's elegant penmanship, and remember that it was invented to brand a substance that offered temporary relief from pain and addiction through another powerful drug. The journey from the back room of an Atlanta pharmacy, fueled by a wounded veteran's desperate need for pain relief, to the largest beverage company on the planet, is an epic tale of chance, capitalism, and chemical compromise. The modern glass of Coca-Cola is harmless, yet it retains a trace of that original rebellious spirit. It is a reminder that the boundary between medicine and refreshment, between cure and vice, has always been a shifting, commercially exploited line. You have now traced the lineage of that subtle flavour, that familiar effervescence, and the history it holds. It is the story of a drug that became a drink, a secret that became a legend, and a local tonic that conquered the world. As the echoes of the courtroom dramas and the clinking of early soda fountains fade, allow yourself to ease back. The intense scrutiny of the past, the chemical secrets, the fear and the ultimate triumph, all of that energy is settling now, much like the final bubbles dissolving in a forgotten glass. You've travelled far tonight, traversing the tumultuous landscape of late 19th century America, a world where vice was often sold as virtue. Take a slow, deep breath and let the historical details drift away. Remember that the great stories often hide in the most familiar places. What you hold in your hand or picture in your mind is a symbol of massive change, a reminder that nothing in history is quite as simple as it seems. The darkness of its origins simply highlights the incredible, almost mythical feat of its transformation. The product that remains is a clean, sweet artifact of a turbulent age. Let the comforting darkness of your room envelop you and allow your thoughts to slow. All the chemical reactions, the legal fights, the advertising blitzes, they all belong to yesterday. Tonight, you are simply at rest. Close your eyes, let your head settle deeply into the pillow, and know that you are safe from the scrutiny of the reformers and the grip of the old elixirs. Sleep now, the secrets are safe in the vault,